Picture this moment. A young aristocrat from Jerusalem's elite circles stands in the grandest temple on earth, surrounded by golden walls that catch the morning light like captured fire. The year is 740 before the Christ. King Uzziah, the only king this man has ever known, lies dead, and the kingdom trembles with uncertainty. But what happens next will shatter every assumption about power, privilege, and purpose that this young man has ever held. In an instant, the temple fills with smoke so thick he can barely breathe. The massive stone doorposts begin to shake like reeds in a hurricane. And above him, impossibly above him, he sees a throne so high, its occupant's robes fill the entire sacred space. 6 winged creatures of fire circle this throne, calling out in voices that make the foundations tremble. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The young man's name is Isaiah. And in this moment of absolute terror and wonder, he will receive a calling that will transform him from a comfortable courtier into one of history's most fearless voices for justice, and ultimately cost him everything. But let's step back. Who was this man before the fire-touched lips and the impossible visions? Isaiah, son of Amoz, lived the life we might recognize today, born into privilege, educated in the finest traditions, with easy access to power. His Hebrew was classical, sophisticated. He knew the names of palace officials, understood the intricate dance of international diplomacy, could read the political winds like a seasoned insider. He was, by every measure, a success. Yet something burned within him even before that temple encounter, a deep awareness of the chasm between Jerusalem's glittering facade and its rotting foundations. While attending court ceremonies and diplomatic receptions, Isaiah witnessed what happened in the shadows. Judges taking bribes, wealthy landowners seizing the fields of struggling families, temple officials growing fat while widows starved just outside the sacred walls. The ox knows its owner, he would later write with cutting irony, and the donkey its master's crib. But Israel does not know. My people do not understand. This was a man who lived between worlds, intimate with both the corridors of power and the cries of the powerless. And when the divine calling came, it would transform that painful awareness into prophetic fire. That morning in the temple, Isaiah thought he was alone. The great bronze altar stood cold. The golden lampstands cast long shadows across the stone floor. Then, without warning, reality split open like a curtain torn in half. The throne that appeared wasn't just large, it was impossibly vast, as if the entire cosmos had rearranged itself around this single point of blazing holiness. The figure seated there radiated such pure otherness that Isaiah couldn't even look directly at it. The train of the divine robe, just the robe, filled the temple from wall to wall like liquid light, but it was the seraphim that nearly stopped his heart. These weren't the cherubic angels of children's books. These were creatures of pure fire, each with 6 wings, 2 covering their faces because even they couldn't bear to look directly upon absolute holiness, 2 covering their feet in reverence, and 2 for flight. They moved like flames given consciousness, calling out in voices that shook stone and bone. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The sound hit Isaiah like a physical force. The doorposts cracked, smoke filled his lungs. And in that moment of cosmic encounter, every pretense, every comfortable assumption, every carefully constructed identity simply dissolved. "Woe is me," he cried out, his voice barely a whisper against the angelic chorus. "I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." Unclean lips. In a culture where words held the power to bless or curse, to build up or tear down, Isaiah understood that his very ability to speak, his gift, his weapon, his craft, was corrupted. How could someone with polluted speech dare to stand in the presence of perfect truth? But then came the moment that would change everything. One of the seraphim flew to the altar, took a burning coal with tongs, and flew directly toward the terrified prophet. Isaiah must have thought he was about to die. Instead, the creature of fire pressed that coal, that burning coal from God's own altar, against his lips. "See," the seraph declared, "this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for." Fire, purification, transformation. In an instant, The aristocrat's polished words were burned away, replaced with something infinitely more dangerous, the capacity to speak truth with divine authority. Then came the voice from the throne, "Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?" And Isaiah, still trembling, still burned, still transformed, heard himself speaking words that would seal his fate. "Here am I, send me." What he learned next would haunt him for the rest of his life. The message he was called to deliver wouldn't soften hearts, it would harden them. His words would bring not immediate repentance, but deeper resistance. He would speak truth to a people who had lost the ability to hear it. "Go and tell this people," came the divine commission. "Be ever hearing but never understanding. Be ever seeing but never perceiving. Make the heart of this people calloused. Make their ears dull and close their eyes." It was a calling that required extraordinary courage, to speak knowing you won't be believed, to warn knowing you won't be heeded, to love a people who will ultimately reject you. But that was just the beginning. Picture the ancient Near East as a chessboard where the pieces are entire peoples and the stakes are nothing less than survival. On one side, Assyria, the iron-fisted superpower grinding westward like an unstoppable war machine. Their army had perfected the art of terror, psychological warfare that broke cities before the first arrow was fired. They didn't just conquer. They systematically destroyed cultures, deported entire populations, and left behind wastelands where civilizations once flourished. In this deadly game, the small kingdoms of Israel and Judah were caught between impossible choices: submit to Assyria and lose their independence, or resist and face annihilation. Isaiah would spend the next 54 years watching kings make these choices and living with the consequences. The first great test came during what historians call the Syro-Ephraimite War, a name that barely captures the terror that gripped Jerusalem when two enemy armies appeared at the city gates in 734 before Christ. Syria and the northern kingdom of Israel had formed an unlikely alliance with a simple demand: Judah must join their anti-Assyrian coalition or be destroyed. When King Ahaz refused, they invaded. In a single day, Judah lost 120,000 soldiers. The king's own son was killed. Palace officials were captured or executed. Jerusalem itself came under siege. Ahaz was 20 years old, terrified, and facing the possible end of his dynasty. In desperation, he walked the city walls, inspecting the water systems, preparing for a siege that could starve his people into submission. That's where Isaiah found him, a young king trying to save his kingdom with purely human calculations. "Take heed, be quiet, do not fear," Isaiah declared, appearing at the conduit of the upper pool with his own young son in tow, a boy whose prophetic name, Shear-Jashub, meant "a remnant shall return." "Do not let your heart be faint because of these two smoldering stubs of firebrands." Two smoldering stubs. That's what Isaiah called the fearsome coalition that had devastated Judah's army. Not because he was minimizing the threat, but because he saw the situation from a completely different perspective. "If you will not believe," Isaiah warned the young king, "surely you shall not be established." But Ahaz had already made his choice. Rather than trust in divine protection, he sent messengers racing toward Assyria with a desperate message: "I am your servant and your son. Come up and save me from the hand of the king of Syria and from the hand of the king of Israel who are rising up against me." The gold from the temple and the royal palace went to buy Assyrian protection. Judah became a vassal state, and Assyrian religious practices began flowing into Jerusalem like a polluting flood. Isaiah had offered a third way: trust in the Holy One of Israel rather than human alliances. But when faced with immediate terror, the king chose the visible army over the invisible God. This is where Isaiah's story becomes deeply personal. His calling didn't just transform his words, it transformed his entire family into living prophecies. His wife was called the prophetess, whether because she shared his gift or simply bore the weight of being married to God's messenger. Their children carried names that served as walking reminders of divine judgment and hope: Shear-Jashub, a remnant shall return. Imagine being Isaiah's son, going to school with a name that predicted your nation's coming devastation. Imagine being his wife, watching your husband deliver messages that made him increasingly isolated from the very society they were called to serve. But in the midst of this political crisis, Isaiah delivered one of history's most famous and mysterious prophecies. When King Ahaz refused to ask for a divine sign, perhaps trying to avoid any commitment to trust God, Isaiah declared, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Immanuel." Immanuel, God with us. Here was the paradox at the heart of Isaiah's message. In the darkest moments, when human kingdoms crumble and human alliances fail, divine presence becomes most real. Not as a distant cosmic force, but as immediate as a child's cry, as personal as a birth, as hopeful as a name that means God is here. This wasn't just a prediction, it was a promise that no matter how overwhelming the darkness, light would find a way to break through. As the years passed, Isaiah's warnings about trusting Assyria proved devastatingly accurate. What began as a protective alliance became a strangling occupation. Tribute payments drained the royal treasury. Assyrian religious symbols appeared in the Jerusalem temple. The independence Ahaz had tried to preserve through alliance was slowly being strangled by it. And still the Assyrian appetite for conquest grew. In 722 before Christ, they finally destroyed the northern kingdom entirely, deporting its population, and leaving behind only scattered refugees who fled south to Jerusalem with tales of unimaginable brutality. Isaiah watched these refugees arrive, families torn apart, communities obliterated, an entire kingdom erased from the map. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who resist the Assyrian war machine. This is what awaits anyone who defies the greatest military force on earth. But when Ahaz died and his son Hezekiah took the throne, everything changed. Hezekiah was everything his father wasn't: devout, reform-minded, and willing to listen to prophetic counsel. Under his leadership, Jerusalem experienced a religious renaissance. Pagan altars were torn down, foreign religious practices were banned, and the temple was restored to its proper function. But Hezekiah faced the same impossible geopolitical reality that had terrorized his father. The Assyrian Empire wasn't getting weaker. If anything, it was getting stronger, more demanding, more brutal in its suppression of rebellions. Isaiah found himself in a completely different role, no longer the ignored voice crying in the wilderness, but a trusted advisor to a king who actually wanted to do what was right. It should have made his job easier. Instead, it made the coming crisis infinitely more heartbreaking. By 705 before Christ, rebellions against Assyria were erupting across the empire. Egypt was promising military support to anyone willing to challenge Assyrian dominance. Babylon was stirring up trouble from the east, and in this moment of apparent Assyrian weakness, King Hezekiah made a fateful decision. Judah would join the rebellion. Isaiah was horrified, not because he supported Assyrian oppression, but because he understood what rebellion would mean for ordinary people. He had seen what happened to the northern kingdom. He knew the Assyrian pattern: swift, brutal, total. Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help, he prophesied, who rely on horses, who trust in the multitude of their chariots and in the great strength of their horsemen, but do not look to the Holy One of Israel, or seek help from the Lord. But this time, Isaiah's warnings fell on deaf ears. Not because Hezekiah was faithless, but because he was trying to balance faith with what looked like political wisdom. Egypt had promised military support. Other kingdoms were joining the rebellion. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to break free from Assyrian tyranny. Isaiah knew better, not because he had access to better intelligence reports, but because he understood the deeper spiritual dynamics at work. Judah's survival didn't depend on military alliances or superior tactics. It depended on trust in the Holy One of Israel. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Jerusalem itself, the last independent remnant of David's kingdom, the city where God had chosen to place his name. In 701, before Christ, Sennacherib of Assyria unleashed the full fury of his war machine against the rebellious kingdoms. His campaign was swift, methodical, and devastating. One by one, Judah's fortified cities fell like dominoes. Lachish, Judah's second largest city, held out for weeks before being overwhelmed. The Assyrians were so proud of its destruction that Sennacherib commissioned massive stone reliefs for his palace showing every detail. the siege towers rolling toward the walls, the battering rams smashing through gates, the lines of captives being led away into exile, the piles of enemy dead. According to Sennacherib's own records, he conquered 46 fortified cities and carried away 150 captives. Judah was being systematically erased from the map, city by city, family by family. And then the Assyrian army appeared on the hills surrounding Jerusalem. Imagine standing on the city walls that morning and seeing the horizon black with enemy troops. Cavalry units stretching as far as the eye could see, siege engines being assembled, the methodical preparation for what everyone knew would be the final battle. Inside the city, Hezekiah had done everything humanly possible to prepare. His engineers had carved a tunnel through 1,750 feet of solid rock, connecting Jerusalem's spring to a pool inside the city walls, an engineering marvel that still carries water today. The city's fortifications had been strengthened, food had been stockpiled, but everyone knew it wouldn't be enough, not against this enemy, not after what they had seen happen to every other city that had tried to resist. That's when the psychological warfare began. The Assyrian field commander, the Rabshakeh, positioned himself just outside Jerusalem's walls and began to speak. Not in Akkadian, the language of diplomacy, but in perfect Hebrew, loud enough for every defender on the wall to hear. His message was calculated to destroy hope itself. "Do not let Hezekiah deceive you," he shouted, "for he will not be able to deliver you out of my hand. Do not let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord by saying, 'The Lord will surely deliver us. This city will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria.'" Then came the devastating catalogue. "Have the gods of the nations delivered them? Gozan, Haran, Rezeph, and the people of Eden who were in Telassar? Where are the king of Hamath, the king of Arpad, the king of the city of Sepharvaim, the king of Hena, or the king of Iva? Where are they now?" That was the question that must have echoed in every defender's heart. All those kingdoms, all those gods, all those hopes for divine deliverance, where had it gotten them? "Do not listen to Hezekiah," the Rabshakeh continued, "when he misleads you by saying, 'The Lord will deliver us.' Has any of the gods of the nations delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria?" The silence on Jerusalem's walls must have been deafening, because the Rabshakeh was right. No god, no army, no alliance had been able to stand against this empire. But then he made a mistake. He crossed a line that transformed this from a political crisis into something far deeper. "Who among all the gods of the countries have delivered their countries out of my hand, that the Lord should deliver Jerusalem out of my hand?" This is where Isaiah's 50 years of ministry, his lifetime of hearing the voice of the Holy One, his fire-touched lips and transformed heart, all came down to a single moment of choice. While Hezekiah's officials tore their clothes in despair, while the city prepared for inevitable destruction, while even faithful people began to wonder if the Assyrian was right, Isaiah stood firm. Not because he had access to secret military intelligence, not because he thought Jerusalem's walls were impregnable, not because he trusted in Egyptian cavalry or Babylonian promises. He stood firm because he had seen the throne room of heaven. He had heard the seraphim declare that the whole earth was full of God's glory. He knew that no earthly king, no matter how powerful, could ultimately stand against the Holy One of Israel. "Therefore thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria," Isaiah prophesied, "He shall not come into this city, nor shoot an arrow there, nor come before it with shield, nor build a siege mound against it. By the way that he came, by the same shall he return. He shall not come into this city, says the Lord. For I will defend this city to save it, for my own sake and for my servant David's sake." Not one arrow. That was Isaiah's promise. In the face of the most powerful military force on earth, when every human calculation suggested certain defeat, the prophet promised that Assyria wouldn't even begin a proper siege. What happened next depends on who tells the story. The biblical account states it simply, "And it came to pass on a certain night that the angel of the Lord went out and killed in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when people arose early in the morning, there were the corpses, all dead." Historians and skeptics offer various explanations. Plague, food poisoning, military coup, strategic withdrawal due to problems elsewhere in the empire. But whatever the mechanism, The result was undeniable. The Assyrian army that had conquered 46 cities, that had never failed to take a target, that had reduced entire kingdoms to rubble, this unstoppable force simply stopped. Sennacherib, the king who boasted of trapping Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, returned to Nineveh without even attempting to breach Jerusalem's walls. His own royal inscriptions, usually filled with boastful details about conquered cities, say only that he received tribute from Hezekiah. Notably absent is any claim to have captured Jerusalem. The city that should have become another entry in the Assyrian catalogue of destroyed capitals remained unconquered. The people who should have joined the long lines of captives being marched into exile remained free. And Isaiah, the aristocrat who had answered a divine calling 50 years earlier, lived to see the most impossible prophecy of his career fulfilled exactly as he had spoken it. But Isaiah's story is about much more than one military victory or one prophet's vindication. It's about the collision between two completely different ways of seeing reality itself. The Assyrian worldview was brutally simple. Might makes right, power determines truth, and the strong survive by eliminating the weak. It was a philosophy that seemed to be working perfectly, until it met something it couldn't understand or overcome. Isaiah represented a radically different vision. Ultimate power belongs not to the strongest army or the richest empire, but to the source of justice itself. True security comes not from dominating others, but from aligning yourself with what is ultimately real and ultimately good. This is why Isaiah's message still echoes across centuries and cultures. Every generation faces the same fundamental choice: trust in the systems of power that seem invincible in their time, or bet everything on the conviction that justice, mercy, and truth are more powerful than armies, more lasting than empires, more real than the apparent facts on the ground. Perhaps Isaiah's most profound insight came not through his political prophecies or his dramatic confrontations with kings, but through his vision of a completely different kind of leadership, what he called the suffering servant. In 4 mysterious passages, Isaiah describes a figure who would achieve victory not through domination, but through service, who would heal others by bearing their pain, who would overcome evil not by destroying enemies, but by absorbing their violence into himself. He was oppressed and afflicted, Isaiah wrote, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. This wasn't the kind of leader anyone expected. Not a warrior king like David, not a wise ruler like Solomon, not even a bold prophet like Isaiah himself. This was someone who would win by losing, who would triumph by suffering, who would save others by sacrificing himself. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, the prophet continued. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. Here was Isaiah's ultimate challenge to every assumption about power. True strength doesn't come from the ability to inflict suffering, but from the willingness to absorb it. Real victory isn't achieved by eliminating enemies, but by transforming them through love that costs everything. It was a vision that would echo through history, inspiring everyone, from early Christian martyrs to modern civil rights leaders, from Mother Teresa to Nelson Mandela. Anyone who discovered that the deepest changes in human hearts come not through coercion, but through the mysterious power of sacrificial love. But Isaiah wasn't content with individual transformation. His vision extended to the transformation of all society, all history, all creation itself. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, he prophesied, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Picture that moment. The weapons of destruction literally reshaped into tools of cultivation. The energy spent on perfecting ways to kill redirected toward perfecting ways to nurture life. The institutions that teach warfare replaced by institutions that teach peace. It wasn't a naive vision that ignored human nature or the reality of evil. Isaiah had seen too much: the brutality of empires, the corruption of leaders, the suffering of innocents, to be naive about anything. But he had also seen the throne room of heaven, and from that perspective, no human arrangement looked permanent. "For behold," he declared, "I create new heavens and a new earth. The former shall not be remembered or come to mind. But be glad and rejoice forever in what I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem as a rejoicing, and her people a joy." This is what sustained Isaiah through decades of opposition, mockery, and apparent failure. He could see beyond the immediate political calculations, beyond the cycle of empire and rebellion, beyond the seemingly endless repetition of violence and oppression. He saw the possibility, no, the certainty, that love would ultimately prove stronger than hate, that justice would outlast all injustice, that hope would survive even the death of hope itself. But visions come with a cost, and Isaiah paid it fully. Tradition holds that he was martyred during the reign of the evil king Manasseh, sawed in half while hiding in a hollow log, executed for the crime of speaking truth to power one too many times. Think about what that means. A man who could have lived comfortably as a court insider, who possessed every privilege his society could offer, chose instead a path that led to increasing isolation, growing opposition, and ultimately violent death. Why? What could possibly motivate someone to give up security, comfort, and ultimately life itself for the sake of messages that most people didn't want to hear? The answer lies in that temple vision from so many years before. Once you've seen ultimate reality, once you've encountered truth so pure it burns, love so complete it demands everything, justice so absolute it makes all human compromises seem like shadow plays, you can never again be satisfied with less. Isaiah had touched something eternal, and everything temporal paled in comparison. He had heard the voice of the one who said, "I am who I am," and all other voices became echoes. He had experienced the presence of perfect holiness, and all human glory became tarnished. That's why he could stand before kings without fear, could contradict the most powerful military leaders in the world, could maintain hope when every circumstance suggested despair. Not because he was naturally brave. The temple vision shows us he was naturally terrified, just like any sane person would be, but because he had been fundamentally changed by an encounter with something bigger than all earthly powers combined. Isaiah's story continues to resonate because every generation faces the same fundamental challenges he confronted. We all live in societies where wealth concentrates in fewer hands, while others struggle to survive. We all witness leaders who prioritize political calculation over moral principle. We all see systems of power that seem utterly immune to change. And we all face the same choice Isaiah faced: accommodation or resistance, comfort or conscience, the path of least resistance, or the call to stand for something bigger than ourselves. The issues may have different names: economic inequality instead of royal corruption, systemic racism instead of judicial bribery, climate change instead of foreign invasion, but the underlying dynamics remain startlingly similar. Those with power use it to preserve their advantages. Those without power suffer the consequences. And in the middle stand those who must choose whether to speak truth that costs something or remain silent for the sake of security. Isaiah's life suggests that true security, the kind that lasts beyond any individual lifetime or political system, comes not from protecting what we have, but from aligning ourselves with forces that are ultimately more powerful than any human institution: justice, compassion, truth, hope. These aren't religious concepts that apply only to believers. They're human realities that transcend any particular faith tradition. Every society depends on some shared commitment to fairness. Every community requires some foundation of trust. Every individual needs some reason to hope that their actions matter, that their sacrifices have meaning, that the arc of history does indeed bend toward justice. Isaiah's story began with fire, the burning coal that touched his lips and transformed his capacity to speak. It ends with fire as well, the burning conviction that no earthly power, no matter how overwhelming it appears, is ultimately more real than the moral structure of the universe itself. That fire still burns. Every time someone chooses principle over profit, every time someone speaks truth despite the cost, every time someone sacrifices personal advantage for the sake of justice, that same transforming flame leaps across the centuries. The aristocrat who answered, "Here am I, send me," in an ancient temple, becomes every person who decides that some things are worth more than safety, more valuable than success, more important than survival itself. The prophet who stood before kings and emperors without flinching becomes every teacher who refuses to compromise educational standards, despite pressure from administrators, every journalist who investigates corruption despite threats from powerful interests, every citizen who votes according to conscience despite social pressure. The visionary who saw swords beaten into plowshares becomes every person who works to transform conflict into cooperation, who turns resources devoted to destruction toward healing instead, who insists that humanity's story doesn't have to end in the repetition of ancient patterns of domination and violence. This is Isaiah's ultimate gift to us, the conviction that transformation is possible. Not easy. The path from corruption to justice, from fear to faith, from despair to hope is always costly, but possible, real, worth every sacrifice it demands. Because in the end, Isaiah discovered what every generation must rediscover for itself. There are fires that consume and fires that purify, powers that destroy and powers that create, voices that deceive and voices that lead toward truth. The prophet who stood in God's fire and emerged transformed reminds us that we too can choose which fire will define us. We too can hear the question echoing across time, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" And we too can answer, "Here am I. Send me." The fire still burns. The choice is still ours. The transformation is still possible. And sometimes, if we listen carefully enough, we can still hear the seraphim calling across the centuries. "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." The whole earth, full of glory, still.